Hello, everyone. Welcome to our session. We're going to be in part four, the part that discusses science and religion today. So the section is entitled Jesus Riding a Dinosaur, which is the best title for a section ever. Do we have to choose between science and the Bible? Now, for those of you who have not read the section, I highly encourage you to do so. He goes very carefully through the Genesis creation story of Genesis 1 and 2, and really deals with a lot of the issues and different perspectives on it that you can have, right? So he talks about the different views of how we interpret creation and put that into historical or scientific reality. He also deals with how we should think about the purpose and the focus of what Genesis was for. Okay, so I'm not going to really focus on that as much as I'm going to approach it from a larger context. So, in the first chapter, in chapter 10, also titled Jesus Riding a Dinosaur, he deals with the issue of how to interpret metaphorical language within the books of the Bible, or within specifically in this section, how do we deal with Genesis? And I want to take a step back and introduce some material that you may have seen if you've seen my other videos. We have a video series that talks about the biblical interpretation that I did about a year or two ago. And I want to return back to that a little bit in order to just sort of refamiliarize you if you have it's been a while since you've seen that video, or if this is one of your first video series by me that you're seeing, for you to be able to know sort of where my perspective about interpretation is. So biblical interpretation is really a facet or a part of how we interpret any literature that we read. So whenever you read a book, whether it's a fiction book or whether it's a nonfiction book, whether you're reading it for a school environment or whether you're reading it for personal amusement or fun, whether you're reading something like a news article that you might find in a newspaper or a magazine or on the internet, or whether you're reading something that comes from an academic perspective, the first thing you have to do in all of those situations is identify how you were supposed to read that text. We often have this almost as an instinctive process, particularly when those of us who have been reading for many years now, we don't really think about what we're thinking about when we read. So there's a scholar from many years ago named Wolfgang Iser, and he wrote a book called The Act of Reading. And when I read it, I thought this is really very informative. So I encourage you, if you're interested in sort of how the process of reading happens, what is happening in our brain when we read, if you will. Wolfgang Iser's The Art of Reading or The Act of Reading, excuse me, is a great resource for you to go to. I'm going to talk about sort of a historical method that was used in biblical interpretation since the early church fathers. And this method is sometimes referred to as the fourfold method. Sometimes it is referred to as the Pardes method. It really depends on sort of what source you're reading it from. In the first few centuries of the Common Era, when we have the New Testament, but we also have writings like the Talmud coming in from Judaism. In the 6th century, we start getting the Quran in Islam. People realize that they have to think about what they're doing when they're reading. And they have to think about whether they read all of their scripture or their authoritative text in the same way. And what they realize, this is true of Judaism, this is true of Christianity, this is true of Islam, that there are basically 4 levels by which we read when we read. So when we approach a sacred or authoritative text, and I'm going to argue this also includes when we go over and we read other texts that we wouldn't necessarily think is sacred text, we read at 4 different levels. Now, the first level is the literary or historical sense. And this level really deals with the meaning as it appears on the page, right? And so oftentimes when people read a news article, right, $50,000 is going to be donated to the Salvation Army, or 100,000 people have been displaced by flooding in California, you understand that as an accurate, literal representation of what is being said. You don't think to interpret that or apply any sort of higher reasoning to that. You read the text in black and white, and you understand it in its literal meaning. And this, of course, is very text-centered. And that's the way I want you to think of it. That first level is where the focus, what Easter would call the locus of meaning, is in the text itself. And you are applying very little of your own interpretation or your own sort of external background to what you're reading. You read it in the meaning of the words that you understand your language, and you don't seem to really add much to it. Now, the next level above that is the typological, or sometimes called the allegorical level. And this is where we begin to use metaphor and analogy in order to understand it. So we're doing a little bit more work. We're bringing in some external or some background material. And I'm using this kind of motion because I want you to think of everything that you've read as sort of hovering around you, excuse me, in the background of what you're reading when you read. So we can kind of think of this as when you need to use study notes or maybe a chart, right? So oftentimes when we read the Bible, people want to use, the footnotes that might occur at the bottom of your English translation. Or you might flip to the back and to some sort of Bible chart to kind of remember, okay, when did this person live? Okay, and what king is this in the sequence? And where does that go? And this is where people bring in things like Bible dictionaries or word studies into their connection. Now, the word that's used here for this type of interpretation within Jewish criticism, in which it's called the Pardes method, is remez. Now, remez really has to do with the sort of mechanism of comparing scripture to other scriptures. And really, that is the smallest sense of what we might think of as happening during this allegorical reading. So in a process of Jewish interpretation known as Gezer Shava, you use one verse to interpret another verse within Scripture. And you do that because of common words. Kimball talks about that in one of his chapters. Let me see if I can pull it up really quickly. When he talks about the word to hover that occurs within the Genesis account. I didn't mark this, and so I have to flip quickly and try to find where he does that. Okay. So this is on page 187 in chapter 12 of his book. He talks about rahaf, which is the word to hover. And the word to hover occurs within Genesis 1:2. The Spirit of the Lord rahaf hovered over the waters. It also occurs in Deuteronomy 32:11, in which God rahaf hovers over Israel like a mother eagle over her chicks. Now, that is a key locus in which you can do what's called Gezer Shava. You can think of Gezer Shava a little bit like doing a word bridge. This word occurs here, this word occurs here. You're going to draw a line between them, and you're going to take those two verses and you're going to put them together. And you're going to understand the one verse in terms of the other verse. You're going to use a verse that might be more clear to interpret the one that is less clear. The problem with this verse, Genesis 1:2 and Deuteronomy 32:11, is that in both cases, the word to hover is metaphorical, right? And yet that metaphor is applied to God in terms of this action of creation. In Genesis 1, it's God hovering in the action of creating the world. In Deuteronomy 32, it's God hovering in the action of creating Israel, of redeeming them out and bringing them into the promised land. And so what does hovering mean? Well, we can't necessarily think of it as just flapping with your wings above something. That literal meaning is not going to work. It doesn't help us understand what's happening. So we've got to take it to the next level. We've got to think of it as a metaphor, right? So what does it mean that God is hovering? Well, the image that we see in Deuteronomy 32:11 of a mother eagle hovering over her chicks, that is spreading her wings out to protect them. Okay, so God is protecting Israel. So we translate or we metaphorize the word to hover to mean to protect. So now we can read the verse that says, God protects Israel like a mother eagle protects her chicks. Okay, now it makes sense. Okay, now we understand what the metaphor means. Well, then through the Gezerah Shava word bridge, we're going to bring that over and says, okay, God is protecting the world by his spirit. Okay, well, here it's a little bit more problematic. What does that mean? And so we can pull it in. All right. So in some verses, we're going to move a little bit further from the text. We're going to start bringing in our own mental or intellectual background into how we're reading things. We have to recognize that what's happening here can't be understood at simply a literal level. We read it first, of course, as a literal level, as we read the words off the page. But then we realize very quickly, or we should realize very quickly, that we have to take it as a metaphor and we have to understand it in terms of what is the metaphor there for, if I can make that pun. All right, now our third level is we move from the literal through maybe the allegorical and we take it to the moral. Now, this is often connected. Now, the ancient interpreters, and with Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they kept them separate. They thought there was allegorical meanings and there were what we might call moral, legal, or homiletical meanings. I'm going to encourage you to kind of think of them together, to think of it as a process of you kind of ascending up a ladder of interpretation or moving away from the text into your own mind and your own contemplation. So when you take that metaphor and you bring it into the next stage, this is where we're going to think of its application. How do I use this verse in my daily life? Now, this is often what we're going to do when we get to more poetic or more prophetic text that we see in the Bible. We're always going to do it with things like Proverbs, right? The book of Proverbs is wonderful. It's these very short, pithy statements that you need to kind of chew on for a little bit. And that's what you're doing here at this third level. The third level is called Drosh, the D in Pardes for Drosh. And when we think about Drosh, we want to kind of chew on it and flip it around and think about what it means. How can we apply it? So we're going to go from text, and that first level, I don't know if I said this word or not, is Peshat, the literal meaning, the P for Pardes. Then we go through Remez, the metaphor meaning. And then we're going to take it to the application level, right, with Drosh, PRD, Pardes. And we're going to go there. And this is really where we should spend most of the time. When Kimball says in his book consistently that the Bible is written not to us, but for us, this is what he's trying to say. He's trying to say that when we approach Scripture, we have to understand that Scripture is written for our good. It's written to teach us something. It might inform us of a historical or a pragmatic understanding of the world. It might tell us about a metaphor about how we understand an infinite God with our finite minds. And it might tell us how to live our lives in response to that. And in fact, this is how Kimball argues we should understand the book of Genesis, particularly the creation story. So on page 168 and 169, he talks about a series of questions. He calls them questions Israel likely had that Genesis was written to answer. And then one of those questions is, are we going to survive from the desert and are we safe? The next question is there really one God? Because Egypt has many gods. Is the God who rescued us still here, or has he left us? Are we alone? Now, you see, all of those questions are answered in the creation account. When God says, in the beginning, God, not Ra and his pantheon of other gods, not some sort of mystical force of order and chaos that's not really embodied and personal. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He's making a statement there in which he says, I got this. You don't have to worry. The God who just took you out of Egypt, who freed you from slavery, is the God who's going to fulfill his promises, because he spoke and everything that we see comes into existence, right? In the other accounts of creation that we see in Egypt and we see in Mesopotamia, for instance, the comparisons that we can make with the Bible, and those are very fruitful to kind of look, what did they do and what does the Bible do and how is it different and how is it the same? In the other accounts around the Bible, we see that the gods build the world in a very similar fashion to which we build things, right? They take things and they assemble them and assemble the world like we might assemble like a Lego set or a house. But God doesn't do that in the Bible. In the Bible, he speaks, and his speech is all he needs to do. He doesn't have to get his God hammer out of the God toolbox and hammer away on the soil to make it do something. He speaks, and his authority is enough. And so in that way, we need to first understand that Genesis 1 is probably not telling us literal history. It might be telling us literal history, but its purpose is probably at that higher drosh level where we're supposed to understand the moral application of the lesson, right? So I'm not going to make an argument about which of the different perspectives on creation, young earth creation, old earth creation, progressive evolutionary creation, atheistic evolutionary creation, day age theory, gap theory. I'm not going to get into that. That is something you're going to have to toil with and chew on. But regardless of what perspective on this passage as a historical, literal text you're going to take, that's not where you need to stay. You need to keep climbing up the ladder and work out the meaning and the application of a text. And that's going to be true of things like Psalms. The Psalms are great when you have a lot of emotions that you need to express. That's what music and song do for us, right? That's why every culture has music and song, because we have things that are inexpressible that we try to contain and give shape to through poetry and through music. But when we take that and we put it in this poetic meter, in this poetic verbiage, in order to give shape to these kind of deeper emotional or deeper sort of, physiological responses to things, we have to understand that we're moving into the realm of metaphor. And when we're in the middle of metaphor, then we're also in the realm of meaning. And when we're in the realm of meaning, we have an opportunity for application. Now, just to complete the whole Pardes argument, we have Peshat, the literal meaning. We have Remez, the allegorical or typological meaning. We have Drosh, the moral, legal, or homiletical meaning. And then we have what's called Sod. And Sod is the mystical or eschatological meaning. It's the meaning in which we sort of extend ourselves up into what the meme would call galaxy brain, right? Like you've seen that meme where it's like the little brain and they got like the little stars and they got like bigger stars and it's like galaxy brain, right? Galaxy brain is Sod. Okay, galaxy brain is this mystical, eschatological understanding of what we read. And that is sort of the top of the chair. And when we've done that, we've kind of moved almost past us. To kind of extend the metaphor that Wolfgang Easter uses, if we begin with the text and then we move into meaning that sort of exists with us and the other books and the background that we have, and then we come to the moral meaning which sort of resides within us, then the eschatological meaning is somewhere over behind that wall. It is galaxy brain compared to everything else. It is so out there that it kind of transcends us. Now, there is a purpose for that in a religious sacred text like the Bible, because we have to understand there is a transcendental reality that the Bible is talking about. When we think about a God who has authority to speak and create stars and planets and plants and animals and mountains and oceans and people, we have to understand that we're not going to get that. That's galaxy brain level stuff. And in the galaxy brain level, we're going to have to move sort of transcendently beyond ourselves. Or you can think of the ladder going up. We've got to go all the way up into the realm in which the transcendent, infinite, divine resides, in which words are going to begin to fail us because we have no experience, no anchor in which to talk about that, right? We have no frame of reference by which to discuss it meaningfully. We have to sort of understand it in this sort of esoteric external way. Now, people love to live in this realm, right? Everybody wants to be galaxy brain in the meme. But the problem with that is that you have no idea whether they're right or wrong because it's transcendent. It's beyond our normal experience. We can't draw on any of what we might call the sense information of our world in which we live 99.9% of our lives, right? When we have these transcendent experience, we almost have to just sort of stop talking because we don't know what we're talking about. And yet people love to live in this, right? There's a whole cottage industry within Christianity, but also but within Judaism, Islam, and other religions, in which people want to be these kind of like gurus that are going to just sort of open up our minds and peel back the onion layers of reality and sort of reveal to us all of these mystical truths, and we have no guarantee that they're right. And the Bible talks about this as well, right? I like to think of the Bible as sort of like a U, right? At the two ends, in the beginning of Genesis and the end of the book of Revelation, we have these kind of, pull back, zoom out, universal, transcendent descriptions, right? We have this like God speaking and creation occurs. We have this revelation in which, weird animal hybrids and angels and beings and personifications of concepts like death all are existing. And I don't know what it means. And neither do you. And yet the Bible reveals this to us because part of that sod experience is the experience in which we live. We know that there's this transcendent experience beyond the tangible, imminent experience of reality that we have. We know in our souls what C.S. Lewis and Pascal and Descartes call sort of like these, describe sort of like this God sense, this God consciousness within us. We know that there's something out there, and our minds as humans is curious about it. And the Bible reveals to us, it peels back the curtain and kind of gives us glimpses of the transcendent reality behind it. But the problem is that that's not where we live 99% of the time. And that's not what 99% of the Bible deals with. The Bible does reveal to us this high mystical experience, but it does so only to connect or reinforce what we should have learned at the lower levels, the closer levels of meaning. There's really nothing in the transcendent sod level that isn't confirmed in literal pashat, in allegorical remez, or in moral drosh. If you're finding something at those levels because you don't think you get it in these levels, you have deceived yourself, because there's nothing up there that is not confirmed below. That's the nature of how revelation works in Scripture. If you're thinking, this is like baby stuff, I want to have like galaxy brain stuff, then you're doing so because of pride, because you want to see yourself or experience or express yourself as somehow higher than all the rest of us. And pride is the root of sin. It's the root of what causes us, just one chapter after the creation story in Genesis 3, it was the pride of humans and of the serpent that leads to our downfall. So we have to resist this urge to want to climb to the top of the ladder just because we can. You might also be expressing this, and in fact, I think this is the argument by which people are so fixated on these pull-out charts and these descriptions of the end times or creation that kind of transcend our understanding, they do so because of prestige and power. And again, that is dangerous ground in which to tread. Because again, in Genesis 3, that was the promise or the deception that the serpent gives us. He promises us that we would eat of this fruit and we would be like God. And every generation since Adam and Eve have been tempted by the same desire to be equal to God so that we might displace God and have control over our own reality. We can make reality in our image. And yet we are not the transcendent, infinite God. And so that is a deception that's going to continue year after year, generation after generation, to lead us to destruction. All right, so just to review, Pardes, that's my preferred one I like for the fourfold interpretation. PRDS stands for the four levels by which we can understand text. Peshat, which means literal interpretation or represents literal interpretation. Remez, which represents the allegorical or typological meaning of something. Drosh, which stands for it represents the moral or legal or application level of interpretation. And then the mystical or eschatological, the transcendent meaning of interpretation. Now, when we read any text, we use these levels in varying degrees in order to understand what the meaning is. And so that's what I encourage you to think about as you approach the Bible. One of the messages about this study is to give you comfort that you can understand the mysteries of the Bible. Because they're not really mysteries. They're just meanings waiting to be claimed and understood by our thinking. We're not called to put our brain on a shelf and not use it. In fact, that's oftentimes the sort of negative depiction of the interaction between science and religion. Many years ago, an atheist scientist named Stephen Jay Gould wrote of what's called the non-overlapping magisteria. And he said that religion and science dwell in two different realms of knowledge, and they have no common ground. That's what he means by non-overlapping magisteria. And the problem is, he's wrong. It's simply not that way. Everything we understand in the context and network of every other thing that we understand. This is why children have so many questions when they start to learn language. That's why they're voracious about reading and learning and gaining experiences, because as they start building the network, they realize that there's so many other things around us. When we're small little babies, our worlds are very small with us, right? We're only kind of concerned with these sort of basic needs that we have. And then our minds sort of expand out a little bit further, and we see that there are other people and that we're separate from mommy and daddy. We are our own person. And as our own person, we can have our own desires, our own needs, our own wants, our own interests. And then we're curious about all the other people and all the other things around us. And our minds keep expanding and growing our entire lives. We're meant to be learning. That's what science tells us. That's what religion tells us. They're not non-overlapping magisteria. They're overlapping magisteria. Our knowledge, our pursuit, our curiosity is no different when we look at how the heavens move or who moves the heavens. So I encourage you, as you read this chapter, as you stew on what he's saying here in part 4, that you understand that knowledge is the goal in everything we do. And so reading the Bible might create points of friction as we try to figure it out, how this and that works. And I encourage you to think about how you want to square the circle, how you want to put the puzzle together. Because the Bible reveals to us what is for us, but not necessarily in a language that's literal, but is meaningful. All right. Now, our next section is part 5. And part 5, again, has another hilarious title. Part 5 is called My God Can Beat Up Your God. Does Christianity Claim All Other Religions Are Wrong? And so that's going to be pages 215 through, got a flippy flip, 252, 215, 215 to 252, 252. We'll be reading part 5 in our next video. And I encourage you to think up the ladder and down the ladder of meaning as you read the chapter, as you read the part, and as you approach and continue to study and think about Scripture in the future. Be blessed, and I will see you next time.